Welcome to this webinar, which is a joint effort of the Center for Trade and Economic Integration, which is at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, and the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, which is an organization, multi-stakeholder, organized to address tensions of cross-border data flows and Internet things. The webinar today is fundamentally based on an important new report that the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network has come out with, and it's called, quite simply, We Need to Talk About Data. The link is in the chat, and you'll want to have a look at it. To discuss this report, after it's briefly introduced, we have a fantastic, actually I can say a legendary panel. Let me just read their names out to you here. Vint Cerf, who is the co-inventor of the internet. Man, I've heard a lot of titles, but that one, co-inventor of the internet, can you imagine what it would be like to go around and say, hi, I'm the co-inventor of the internet? And just to top it all off, he's also a vice president of Google. There's a rounding error, that comes second. Now, the rest of us aren't quite on this level of engagement, but we're very happy to have Vint here. So Lorrayne Porciuncula is the main author of this report, and she's going to spend some time introducing the report, but then join the panel discussion. And we have Miss Tuthill, who's Counsellor of the WTO. She is specialized in trade and services and been working on all things digital, well, for a very long time. She's a icon here in Geneva and an important observer to the entire process. Now, the reason why we're talking about this, and the reason we're talking about it in Geneva, I mean, if you could say this is anywhere, it's in Geneva, it's because data intersects with the trading system in many very difficult ways, where people have not even begun to figure out how to deal with it. And so the very notion that we need to struggle with what is data, how does it interact with the trade system, how does it affect business, all that sort of thing is still a work in progress. And I hope this seminar, and I know that the report helps advance that. So with that, I am just going to go straight into the substance. And what we're going to do is start with Lorrayne, who's going to present the report, and then we'll turn to the panel for discussion. Lorrayne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Richard, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to present the report that we prepared in jurisdiction, but also to compose this legendary panel with some of the key contributors of our report. And this was truly a result of a consultation, months of consultation with different stakeholders who contributed to this report either by participating in interviews or through virtual roundtables through our ad hoc group. And this report was possible through the generous contribution of the German government, and it was launched in a conference that worked with the government of Japan. So at the outset, this was an exercise that really sought to unpack two polarizing expressions between free flow of data and data sovereignty, and then we ended up going much more than that and trying to understand what is the more nuanced conversation that we can have about data, and how can we help increase the awareness of this conversation around data to policymakers, practitioners, and the public in general, and how we can help shape this debate going forward. So the structure of the report is very simple. A first section on data, a second on free flow of data, and a third on data sovereignty. And then we have a moving forward section where we highlight the key messages and recommendations of the report. So first on data, we first need to understand what data is like and what data is not like. There are analogies around data everywhere. Data is like oil, data is the new currency, even data is the new avocado because of its shelf life. Analogies are useful to understand different situations, and understand how how unfamiliar or familiar they are with what we know. But taking them too literally can lead to misguided policy choices. At the same time, the world of data is growing and is diverse. It's prone to overlapping modes of classification, and this complexity is further exacerbated by the variety of actors who are connected by nonlinear relations and value chains. And then finally, data is different from goods and services. It's a non-frivolous resource which can be replicated and combined in numerous value chains without being depleted. And data is also very contextual. And it's extremely hard to measure its true economic and social value. So the conclusion here in this section is that although the issue of location of data is one where much of the debate revolves around, where data is being stored and processed is usually a particular issue of concern for policymakers, we conclude in this section that we should be trying to shift the focus on who collects, processes, and accesses the data and for what purposes, which is of high relevance and should be a topic of further discussion. Then the second section of the report goes into unpacking what we mean by free flow of data. So first, it's important to recognize that the discussion around free flow of data is strongly influenced by existing tensions around free trade. The point here is that even for classic goods, while free trade is advocated as a default, complex frameworks, and the WTO frameworks are example of that, are still necessary to address different policy objectives here. And for data, the principle of free flow of data is a direct result of internet architecture. And I'm sure Vint is going to discuss this further later. The internet is all about data flows, and it's generally conceived as agnostic to its contents and the contents of the packets being transported. So how has the principle of free flow of data become immersed in the international policy agenda? So this principle responded to growing concerns around data protection and privacy issues around the late 70s, and it then became a trade issue in the late 90s. So there's been, since then, really limited advance on that front, and stakeholders still not fully agree on metrics, and sometimes not even the vocabulary to deal with data in the trade realm. In a nutshell, it remains very difficult to address the issue of trade in a multilateral forum. And concerns exist regarding the interdynamics of data, and the cross-border data flows raise concerns around security, economy, and human rights dimensions. The main differences here are the properties of big data, particularly the 3Vs, volume, velocity, and variety. And moreover, the speed of the adaptation itself is a real concern. It leads to a frantic legal patching in an uncoordinated manner. And this is a real problem because it causes uncertainty in general, which we all know it's bad for business, but particularly to SMEs that need to navigate an increasingly complex patchwork of regulations, but in general it causes contradictions and therefore reducing trust in general. And the value of data is maximized when it is flowing and it's used with trust across borders and sectors. And so dealing with potential misuses of data, as we conclude in the section, while preserving its free technical nature, requires dedicated trust-building frameworks. So the third section of the report goes to unpack what we mean by what is meant by data sovereignty. So unpacking the data sovereignty first requires to recall the historic significance and powerful hold in the political discourse and the concept of sovereignty itself as the supreme authority of state over a particular territory. And this is a foundational paradigm of our international system, the sovereignty one. However, the non-geographic nature of the internet really challenges this. And the digital age brings increasingly that what we see is an emergency of what we call a normative plurality. So what is data sovereignty? In a nutshell, it's a reaction by states to a sense of loss of control but it's also connected to a variety of related concepts, information sovereignty, digital sovereignty. And what's interesting here is that there's a multiplicity of policy objectives under the umbrella called data sovereignty. And that at the same time, this is not only about states, as many other actors are calling for this concept, such as corporations, individuals, and the indigenous communities. And so the conclusion is that there isn't a single definition of data sovereignty, and that it can both be explained and perceived in very different and sometimes conflicting ways. So data sovereignty measures can come in different shapes, as it comes with different meanings as well. It can take the form of data localization regulations, or less evident measures around contractual requirements, for example. And most importantly, because the concept is still very fuzzy, its implementation is prone to unintended consequences, which can have systemic effects if generalized. So what is at stake here? Data connects with territories and jurisdictions in multiple ways. So therefore, what we argue is that there is an issue of enabling an ecosystem of overlapping applicable rules and redefining the exercise of sovereignties in the digital realm. So moving forward, we have three messages that stem from the report. The first one is that we need to organize a global multi-stakeholder debate, that this conversation on the future of data and data governance cannot be limited only to a few countries, and that the characteristics of data needs to be socialized because it's so different from other goods and services. At the same time, designing, developing any approach to solve the issues that emerge requires involvement of all stakeholders and not only states, and that the data discussion needs to be conducted in a way which is more cross-sectorial and less one that is conducted in policy silos. The second message is that we need to have a more nuanced conversation around building what are our common objectives. This is a very novel and complex issue because data is so different, because of the diversity of uses across sectors, because of the numerous norm setters involved, and caution is also needed on how we use the analogies, on the concerns that are being raised, and also on the implementation pitfalls of a lot of solutions that are being trying to be implemented. And so common objectives to guide efforts around how do we maximize our well-being, how do we address issues, and how we define the distribution of responsibilities are really paramount here for a more nuanced conversation. And the third message is one of innovation, is that we need to have new innovative approaches to deal with the issue of data. So new tools and new governance solutions, both in a technical aspect and in terms of normative frameworks, but also in terms of concept. And examples of those are the concepts such as free flow of trust, data of trust, with trust and governance innovation that is being promoted by Japan, or the concept of digital self-determination and data spaces by Swiss. And another concept that we are exploring moving forward after we've produced this report is the concept of the data sphere in itself, trying to understand what is conceiving that notion of space where data exists as a more holistic manner, so we can have a conversation which is more cross-sectorial and more holistic. And going forward, we're incubating a new initiative at Internet Jurisdiction in that vein, thinking about how do we want the data sphere to be governed in the future. So with that, I think, and I give the floor back to Richard. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for that quick introduction. Let me just stress again that you'll probably want to have a look at this report. It's very accessible. It lays out a lot of the issues with lots of infographics you saw. So it will be, it's not your usual dull read, and you will have profited from it no matter how familiar you are with it. So please do read it. Now, I have to make a couple of apologies because I have flubbed my introductory remarks. First of all, I forgot to introduce Michael Kende, who's who works at the Graduate Institute here with me. He's a senior fellow and visiting lecturer at the Graduate Institute. He's also formerly the chief economist of the Internet Society and well known in this community. And recently the author of a book called The Flip Side of Free, which is a really interesting book about how privacy and internet economics works out as well. Maybe you could put the link in the chat for that book as well. Now, the other thing I forgot to say was that the South Ambassador was scheduled to be on this panel, the South Ambassador to the WTO. And those of us in Geneva know that South Africa and India and a number of developing countries have quite different views about free flow of data and the benefits of that and signing binding agreements whatsoever. And Lee Tuthill from the WTO Secretariat has agreed to step in at the last minute. And when I mean that she canceled this morning. So it was not easy to deal with that. Now, let me pass the floor to Lee, and I just want to ask you, so how do you see data flows fitting into the discussion? And also, why is the issue of data flow so politically charged? And so what are the objections and concerns of this? And if you dare, maybe you might say one or two words about what you think the South African ambassador might have said. Lee, the floor is yours.
Well, I won't name South Africa, but there are a number of concerns that South Africa has expressed that a few other governments have also expressed. But concerns aren't necessarily a North-South issue in all cases. Let me just start with your first question. How do you see data flows fitting into the trade discussions? I think they definitely fit into the trade discussions. And the short answer is yes, they do. Business, including international trade, has been conducted online for some time now. It's certainly not new at all. I met a guy in the mid-90s who was, before internet was really up and running, who was providing financial information services over satellite links at the time. And so it's only a small step to move those kind of that kind of online trade to another vehicle such as the internet. And whether supplied online or enabled online by global communications, i.e. the back office is all online, as in the logistics sector. I mean, the movement of data and information permeates trade. Let me just say quickly, I've said in other panels that I disagree that data is different, but there's two layers here. There's the information layer that since I came to the WTO in 1990, we were negotiating the GATS, and we already were very clear on the idea that services were extremely information intensive, and that's the reason for existence of the Annex on Telecommunications of the GATS, in recognition of the need for service suppliers by virtue of their information intensity to have access to communications. Okay. Why is it so politically charged? And we'll try to stick to some of the things we've heard in the trade discussions. And in the trade discussions, obviously privacy has come up, and it's not, privacy is a very politically and emotionally charged issue, more so in some regions or some economies than others. But it's got its own emotional and political baggage with it. You have, for example, cybersecurity and national security, which are slightly different but overlapping concerns. And again, I won't use the word sovereignty here exactly, but that's a sense of governments losing control over the implementation of their own legal systems in a world in which communications are global rather than geographic or nationally based, which goes back to some of what Lorrayne pointed out. And we even have a bit of controversy that's in the same vein of governments being able to implement their regulatory mandate if data is not, for example, residing in their country where a regulator can easily get at it. And so you can see that the gamut of some of these issues are not north-south per se. It's really concerns of a great many members for implementing certain policy objectives in a world where they don't have national control over everything that happens. Also in the trade sense, there's this very politically charged issue of the competitive landscape. is there a very uneven playing field here? That in part maybe the internet and the way it works and then the networked kind of economics here leads to an uneven playing field where huge players have a lot of influence and in fact making it very difficult for a lot of reasons for the small new players to enter the market. So market entry can be extremely challenging in the particular environment and based on the reasons for which large players have become so large, right? Now, what are the objectives and concerns we've heard in the WTO in this regard? Obviously, there are governments who believe that the free flow of data is incredibly important to businesses and to trade, and that it's among their highest priorities in everything being discussed in Geneva is that trade flow freely over internet and other forms of networks, and for the reasons I mentioned at the very beginning. But I think what's behind some of the objectives of trade negotiators is the idea that will there be winners and losers? And if there be losers in the internet economy, will we be among the losers, right? So you have governments such as South Africa and others talking about the importance of having a digital industrial policy. And let me try to somewhat paraphrase that. I mean, I go back to where when I was in university, import substitution was a very popular national strategy for economic development and trade. And yeah, import substitution, from what I observed over the years, in many cases, it didn't really work. And in a few cases it did. But I mean, that's one of the objectives of digital industrial policy. Infant industry argument that economists talk about. We don't hear as much about that anymore, but it's come back to us when we see that so many companies have a difficulty basically adopting digital commercial models on the global scale, as well as there's even in some industrialized countries the sense that because we don't seem to be on the winning side at the moment, we'd like to create national champions. So I think you have a lot of these kind of concerns when you look at the economic and trade side of things. I've left out some of the other things that I don't think are as directly related to trade in the interest of not overlapping with other people. But all of these concerns I've mentioned lead to a desire wanting to catch up, not wanting to be left out. Maybe there's other ways these can be handled, or we'll see. Now, in terms of, in the final analysis, I think, how does digital global business work? I mean, I walked in the door in April of 1990, and I was assigned telecommunications and computer services. And frankly, watching this industry, the ICT industry over the years, it was always, and even more so today, it's a globalized industry. Commercial relations are global between customers and between companies partnering with one another. I visited Bangalore back in 1998, and that's how Bangalore became, a cyber center of IT activity, is because some multinationals initially put their research arms there, and those resulted in spin-offs of small companies that were Indian-owned companies. So you have this outsourcing, you might call it. You finally have, like manufacturing sector, the digital services, their value chains are global. And I could name a lot of examples, but it would take too long. They're organized in a global way.
Some of that in the Q&A. I just want to get through all the progress making.
All right. My final point is looking at models for data regulation, which is, I think, what people need very much, as Lorrayne said, to consult on and consult a variety of stakeholders, whether it be at the national or multilateral or regional level, is when you're looking for models for data regulation, I think that we should be careful of what I call an apple and oranges problem. The solutions that some larger countries or regions are coming up with today may not work for smaller countries and poorer regions. I'm very concerned that, cut and paste policies in one place into other places like smaller countries won't work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. So, I mean, the points you were making about the competition, I think, are dead on. We had an event last year where the Indian ambassador very eloquently explained that it's just too soon to write hard rules because we don't know how this works out. And they are a little concerned that this is like the UK, who opened up to free trade after they established a dominant position in industry in the mid 1800s. And so that now that the West is ahead, now they want to open up. So that's their concern. But let me also remind the audience that we're going to have about 15-20 minutes for a question and answer at the end. Please put your questions into the Q&A function because the chat is going too fast. People are talking to themselves there, which is great, but I can't follow all the Q&A. So put it in the Q&A. Now comes the moment, presumably why most of you came to this discussion. I'll put the floor over to Vint, and I'm going to add, just to provoke a little bit, the questions. Why does data matter so much for the trade discussion? What's different about data, if it is, and what are some sort of potential new approaches to it? Vint, please.
Well, thanks very much. And I really appreciated Lee Tuthill's summary of so many different aspects of data and trade. Let me just suggest a few things. First of all, from my point of view, the free flow of data is very important because our data centers are scattered all over the world, and it's important for us to be able to move data back and forth so as to make sure that nothing gets lost. In other words, we replicate the data so that even the loss of a whole data center doesn't lose anyone's information. So the freedom to do that is a very important property for us and others who operate these multinational data centers. So the rules on and restrictions on the flow of data could have a fairly significant impact on that particular very important issue. The other thing, which is pretty clear, is that the scale and volume of data transport is extraordinary and getting higher and higher. It's not the same as containers showing up at ports and being inspected, even though there is a huge amount of that too. But when you look at data flows that are in the petabytes or zettabytes, you can't examine that manually. And you probably can't even examine it, using artificial intelligence and machine learning. Even if the processing power were there, it's not clear whether the examination would produce useful results. So the scale of data flow, I think, is strikingly different from the scale of physical flow of materials in trade. I have to tell you, there was one woman in the UK who was very concerned about content, and she wanted, to have content censored as it was, transiting the oceans from one place to another. And she was particularly concerned about video, and she thought that it should be easy to do this. You just cut the fiber and you look at the little video that's coming through the fiber. And of course, she didn't appreciate that that was all digitized and it was just ones and zeros that had to be interpreted. I would say that among the tactics that we might consider, instead of trying to control flow at the physical layers of, where do the bits go, let the bits flow, but let's focus on access control. Let's protect the data flows at higher levels in the architecture, where we have something to say about how access is provided, whether it's encrypted and people have to show authorities in order to get access to it. But access control may turn out to be a much better way of framing the problem than literally the flow of the bits. The disruption of digital trade is actually very noticeable when networks fail. And as Lee pointed out, and I hope I'm not putting words in Lee's mouth, but I believe that she implied that in order to carry out trade, that information has to flow as well. And when those flows are interrupted, trade is interrupted. And I think we're finding that increasingly true. Certainly in terms of digital trade, a denial of service attack or a ransomware attack can have a dramatic effect on the functionality of trade. So I think just a couple of other things, and then I think others should have a chance to speak. The privacy issue and the piracy issue, which didn't get raised exactly, but which I like because of the pun. Privacy and piracy sound almost like the same thing, and they're both big problems in the data space, need to be dealt with somehow. Security has to be dealt with. Again, I'm of the opinion that access control is our key here to framing the problem and deciding how we can achieve the objective of protection without necessarily operating down in the physical layers of the system. The one last point I think I want to make about winners and losers, if in fact it is thought that there have to be winners and losers, let us ask the question, must there be winners and losers? Can there not be all wins? And it's my view that in the data space, we should try very, very hard for that outcome where everyone benefits. And to give you what I believe is a fair and concrete example of benefit, during the period of the pandemic, the most dramatic development of vaccines occurred in a period of less than a year, partly in consequence of the sharing of information, particularly the early sequencing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which gave clue to the people who were trying to develop vaccine responses. And that sharing of data, I think, produced a remarkable result. And I would argue that there are many other examples in which data sharing has been extremely beneficial. So I hope that this discussion and the parties like Lee and others who are struggling with regulatory frameworks will keep in mind that the flow of data can and will be extremely valuable for everyone. So I'll stop there and thank you for the time and look forward to the rest of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Vint. That was useful and insightful, and I'm sure a lot of people are gonna pick up on that in the Q&A as we go on. So the next panelist is Michael Kennedy, and after Michael Kennedy, we're gonna have a first question from Richard Hill, who's a notable doubting Thomas on this whole subject. So Michael, you go first. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how data flows are governed today and how to possibly bridge that with trade. And just start by pointing out that cross-border data flows can take place for many reasons. It's not just for trade. And Vint pointed to two of those. Companies like Google are transferring data all the time across borders for processing, analysis, storage. Researchers for the vaccines are exchanging traffic, individuals. So there's a lot of traffic that's being exchanged that doesn't have anything to do with trade. And in fact, currently data flows are governed typically within domestic regulations on data protection and privacy outside the context of trade. But they do allow for data transfers, and there's a variety of ways that that's done. Broadly speaking, you could think of free flows of data for some countries and regions, or constraints on flows. Free flows of data can take place across borders without prior approval. There may be some standards or self-certification or some accountability ex post if privacy policies aren't followed. And that's largely the case for the US and many Asia-Pacific countries under the APEC rules, where some low-income countries may not have any restrictions yet on flows of traffic. And in other regions, there's constraints where you need some kind of a prior agreement or approval that certain countries can have data transferred to them, or companies within countries. And that's largely true for the EU, although the policy with the US on the privacy shield for companies is not fully in place yet. And other countries have put in place data sovereignty rules for keeping data local for storage or processing purposes. They often focus on particular types of data, health and financial data. There's rules on transfers of data. And I would just say the data sovereignty laws don't really seem to be the solution even to the problems that they're trying to solve. For instance, one of the typical arguments is for security. I just ran across an example of a company in Kenya that had a ransomware attack that completely shut it down, like many other companies that are being shut down today. But they were using a cloud service, and they had luckily ticked a box that said that they wanted a resilience option, meaning that all the data was stored in another data center in another country, completely shielded from the country from Kenya. And that allowed them to go back up in 6 hours, unlike the recent case of the pipeline in the US, for instance. But that was possible because the data could flow. And the company in Kenya might not have known where that data was being located. That was up to the cloud service provider. But it left a lot of redundancy and let the company keep going. So under strict data sovereignty, they might not have been able to do that, and they might have gone under. But in general, all of these national data regulations focus on domestic data. They put constraints on the transfers for the reasons we discussed, cybersecurity and privacy and others. Whereas a digital trade is really cross-border by definition. Every transaction has parties in at least 2 countries that have to access the data. And it's not just for buying or selling goods or services, but the credit card information is in multiple countries. If it's a good, logistics are in multiple countries. So there's a lot of data flow, and there has to be rules to allow that. And the question is how to enable the necessary data transfers to get the value from the trade, but to protect the data and provide security within the country. And I would argue that that since this is not just a digital trade issue, there's a lot of other issues that are being addressed in different ways. I would really agree with what I think Lee said, that there should be some models for data regulation, some minimum harmonization of rules so that data can be transferred but kept secure within a country and can easily transferred without looking at or approving every country or every company within a country for the transfer. And that may not be best done within a trade context because it's not all related to trade, but maybe with model laws like the UNCITRAL, electronic signatures, or some other soft laws. So just finally, World Bank just came out with some data that shows that strong domestic data protection can promote trade flows, which is generally good for countries. But the key is to allow countries to impose adequate data protections for all data in their country, but also enable low-cost cross-border data flows and digital trade. So I'll pause there for questions, and I guess looking forward to some questions in chat.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was very succinct. Now, we're going to turn, is Richard Hill online here? Or
he definitely is. At least I've seen many comments in the chat.
Yeah, but I think he's going to do it on video. So in the meantime, what I'll do is I'll throw out a couple of the interesting questions from the Q&A. I think our technical wizard, Michael, is going to, the other Michael, is going to get him online if that's possible. But in the meantime, let me just throw out these questions, which I think are really interesting. I mean, my reaction to the comments and the reports is it's dancing around some of the hardest issues. And so let me just bring those out. Here's one question. Please comment on the Great Firewall of China, economic, legal, and technological impact. How does it develop and change our understanding of data flows in the internet? So that's from Vandana. The other is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and how that interacts with these things. These are some, restricting data. Is it going to lead to a splinter net and things like that? And then lastly, Ambassador Raymond Sanner has raised the question of satellite transmission. I think this is a relatively technical question that could be answered, but is data that goes up to the satellite and then comes back down into the country, is that counting as crossing borders? Is that, it's not traditionally really crossing a border, so those are some issues. If I can throw it back also to the panel, and Lee, maybe Lorrayne, you have not actually had a chance to interact with the comments of the others. Would you like to go first and say a few words of what the other panelists said? or those few questions that I picked out?
Sure.
Richard, I'm sorry, Richard. If
yes.
we could start with Richard Hill, if you don't mind. I've got him online right now.
Okay, we got Richard Hill online. So Lorrayne, hold on. Okay.
I won't move.
All right, Richard, please. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for that. I won't repeat all the stuff I posted to the chat. I'm well known for doing that. But I really like the Lee. Thank you, Lee. Lee and I are old timers. Actually, I'm even older than Lee. Lee's reference to the fact that, in the good old days, we actually were already doing data transfer well before the internet. In fact, we were doing it in the 1990s. And it worked fine then. It was called electronic data interchange. And guess what? It's still working. So I'm always astonished when people come along and say, oh, we need all these new WTO rules to do data transfer. Why? And we've seen with the pandemic, data flows have increased, electronic commerce has increased, everything's working fine. So I do agree that we need some rules, but we don't need the actual rules that are being proposed in WTO, because when you dig down and look at them, the purpose of those rules is simply to enshrine the current system where a few very large dominant companies are excluding data and making all the money, and nobody else is making the money. Michael Kende has a very innovative idea in his book, which I highly recommend, which is maybe on antitrust now. We should not look at the effect on consumers or other complicated stuff, but how much data you have. If a company has a huge amount of data, then you can have a suspicion that maybe they're dominant. Cory Doctorow has got another great idea. Maybe we should force interoperability of data so that you could actually move from Facebook to some putative competitor of Facebook. Why is there no competitor of Facebook? Well, because of network effects. We know that, right? Everybody's on Facebook except me, because everybody else is on Facebook. Well, if you could actually transfer your profile easily, maybe you could have competition. And the key point, really, that has not been made enough, although it's been mentioned, especially on the chat, is we needed equitable sharing of the value added of data, because right now it's accruing to literally a handful of men, mostly in Silicon Valley and a couple of guys in China, and it's just totally unbalanced. You've seen these companies now have values which are larger than the GDP of entire countries, and they have great political power to lobbying, et cetera, et cetera. So the question I posted both to the chat and the Q&A is really, why would anybody think that you can negotiate this stuff in WTO? As Michael pointed out, they're not experts. It's the least open, least participatory, least multi-stakeholder international organization of any of them. As a civil society activist, I can participate in the ITU stuff on the Swiss delegation. I can't speak, but I can listen and so on. I'm basically totally locked out of WTO, except for this little annual forum they do once in a while, which really doesn't have any effect on anything. So yes, we do need multi-stakeholder processes to figure out what to do with data. I do agree with the paper. It's complicated. It's not obvious. Analogies are only partly helpful. But whatever you do, don't do it in WTO. That's the worst place in the world to even conceive of doing this. Does anybody agree with me? That was the question.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question, Richard. And now I will turn over to Lorrayne. I don't know how much of that you want to handle, Lorrayne, or just why don't you pick and choose from the reactions of the other panelists, the questions we've heard, and I'm sure somebody will come in and address Richard Hill's comments as well. Please, Lorrayne, you're first.
Yes, I'm actually happy to jump on what Richard Hill just said. I think that he's right in terms of this problem is not going to be solved at the WTO. It's not going to be solved at the ITU. It's not going to be solved by only one group. It requires a multifold of solutions for us to deal with the aspect of data. It will come through technical solutions. It will come through regulations, both national and international. It won't be only one single forum that will address all of those issues, because data is intertwined with all sectors and all policy aspects. And I guess that's what we're trying to say in the paper. We need to think about policy as well as a type of technology in terms of versioning and how we can adapt it as we see new emerging challenges and when we see bugs, and how do we keep improving it and really building it in a way that it's more generative than it is, that is less opaque, that is less siloed. So here's my very high level reaction to some of the comments. We learn by looking into cases of what worked and what didn't in different sectors. My background is on telecom regulation. There's a lot to learn there, and also in terms of competition instruments that can be used. The trade angle can also bring a lot to the table, and so does the privacy. But dealing and addressing the issue of data as a whole won't be solved by only one instrument or one forum alone, or looking only into specific cases. We need to try to learn through the lenses of different perspectives and see how we can move forward, and sometimes take steps back and so we can give a couple of ones forward. I think it's going to be a long process, but I have to agree, it needs to be more open, and it needs to be more transparent and more participative.
Thank you very much. Why don't we just go through in the same order we did before? So I'll turn back to Lee for reactions to what other panelists said, or the questions that you've heard. I'll throw in some more questions if it slows down.
Yeah, thank you. I will address Richard's question and a couple of things. Look, Richard, the main problem I have with your question is you say, should WTO be doing this? And I don't think there's a clear understanding of what this is. I mean, the WTO basically sets principles for international trade. It doesn't get into technical standards. It doesn't get into, exactly what anybody's law or regulations say. And I think we saw that, Richard, back when the WTO included telecommunications in the services agreement. There was a fear that the WTO would take over the telecommunications sector. In fact, it had little or no effect on what ITU did, except that some of the kinds of obligations we came up with that were very general, like that universal service should be competition friendly, became the issues of work programs and so on in the ITU. We didn't supplant the ITU at all. And in terms of multi-stakeholder, well, we have a slightly strange tradition in the WTO that multi-stakeholder consultation should happen in capitals, and that governments bring us a national position reflecting all the views of stakeholders. And I've done, probably, I might exaggerate, hundreds of technical assistance seminars in every country in the world, the developing countries at least, and they have, without question, in services and e-commerce, been multi-stakeholder national seminars. They've set up multi-stakeholder national councils. It is happening, in the way that the WTO expects it to happen at the national level. So it isn't that there is no multi-stakeholder input. It's just we have a tradition of doing it somewhat differently. Now, what is this? I mean, you have since 1995, the services agreement had binding market access commitments on cross-border supply that already imply that any restriction on data across borders by service suppliers is already covered by the agreement. So this is something that's existed since 1995. Again, governments have exceptions for things like privacy, things like dealing with fraud that were built in even before the negotiators were thinking about the internet, but they're there for many of these internet concerns. And I must say, the concerns I listed, that many of them are European or Indian or South African or other governments' concerns, they are serious concerns. But I think the trading system already recognized many of them, already deals with them probably very effectively. And what we're doing in e-commerce is trying to have some additional principles that would deal with things. They don't get into the micromanagement level. I was asked once whether WTO would take over domain name issues, and I said, oh my goodness, no.
Thank you very much, Lee. If I can go to you, Vint, I don't know which ones of those you want to pick up, but I would also personally like to hear whether you think we're going towards a splinter net where the different jurisdictions are really separating and will be setting rules jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to intervene. Fragmentation is quite real, and there was a report at the IGF, I think 2015 or 2016, on fragmentation of the internet and the various ways in which that happens. It's not just national policy. There are at other layers in the architecture, you get various kinds of fragmentation which interferes with free flow. What I actually wanted to speak to was the interoperability point that Richard brought up and Cory Doctorow was arguing for, and I wanted to give you two examples where, one example where interoperability worked extraordinarily well and another one where it didn't. And in order to give you a concrete appreciation for what I think Cory is getting at. Way back in 1988, there were a number of email systems. Remembering email was developed in 1971 on the ARPANET. And then there were commercial email service providers like CompuServe and Telemail and OnTime and Geisco and so on. MCI Mail was another one which I helped to build. And they were all separate little fiefdoms. They weren't interconnected. So if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to be a subscriber to each of the various email services. And then in 1989, they all got interconnected to the internet. And because they adopted the same standards for identification of the user mailboxes, everyone could talk to everyone else. It didn't matter which one you had subscribed to because they were all interconnected through the internet. So that was a case where interoperability led to competition, real, and choice for the users. Then another technology came along. AOL, I think, was probably the pioneer. It was called instant messaging. Some of you will remember that. And it turned out that there were a number of different instant messaging services, and they could never agree to interconnect. And the reason they couldn't agree is that in order for instant messaging to work, you had to tell the other guys who was logged in to your system so that the others would know whether they could have an instant messaging exchange. Nobody wanted to share the information about their subscribers in order to make that work. So they never, even though standards were made, nobody adopted them. So those are examples of, two examples of interoperability that it provided choice in one case and failed in another. There's one other notion that I would like to put on the table, and that's provenance, which is a term which is becoming more commonly used in context of data, data origins and data exchange. Although we sort of understand what it means when it's a fancy, expensive painting, where did it come from and do we know if it's real or not, or is it a fake? Provenance of data may turn out to be an important idea, still to be worked out, but it may help when we're trying to establish rules about what data can flow from point A to point B, or when it gets to point B, what can we make of it? What should we make of it? It's a very not well-defined notion, I think, in the data world, but I think it might be relevant to spend time thinking about it. So I'll stop there, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Vint. So I'm going to turn back to Michael Kende to let you pick up any points that you mentioned. And then I'm going to give Lorrayne the last word. And I'm going to ask her the very difficult question is, maybe it's too late to have this conversation. Maybe the regulation, this thing is happening so fast that it'll be done by the time we actually hold the meeting and pass the laws. So you ponder that, Lorrayne, and I'm just going to hand it over to Michael Kende, please.
Thank you. Yes, I just noticed some points. I'll try and speak up a bit. I don't know what happened, but hopefully I can be heard now. I wanted to pick up the kind of splinter net points. I think that the question about the GDPR really points to why data flows should be dealt with separately from digital trade. So the GDPR determines what countries or what companies within countries data for European nationals can be transferred to. The part about companies transfers has been challenged a few times. Most recently, the Privacy Shield, raising some questions about the ability of companies like Facebook and by extension Google to be able to transfer data within their own company from the EU to the US, whether the US is providing adequate protection under the GDPR for data. That has nothing to do with trade, that's within the company. It's not really creating a splinter net, but it's raising costs, and it's showing why there should be some harmonization of these laws allowing data transfers under knowable conditions where every country is comfortable that the data of their nationals are being protected, but the transfers can take place at low cost. Digital trade would come on top of that. Digital trade, as I said, has to involve transfers of data, but that really would come on top of it because it involves another set of rules about goods and services. That, of course, is all different from the Great Firewall of China, and there was a question about that, where that's really impacting the ability to use services across the firewall, across the countries, and starting to lose out on some of the amazing network effects and economies that are taking place through the internet by not just looking at the data transfers, but really the use of the applications. And there is some danger there, of course, of fragmenting internets and losing some of the value of this 4 billion person network that we're all on now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have 4 minutes left, and I would like to give the last word to Lorrayne, who authored this great report, which has brought us together today. I'm not going to say anything at the end, but I do want to say that it's pretty clear that this conversation needs to continue, and I agree very much that it needs to be a multi-stakeholder discussion, and maybe the next one we will bring in more industry and more people who are benefiting and losing from the regulation. So, Lorrayne, is it too late to actually have this conversation about data?
I really like this question, Richard. What I want to say is no, it cannot be, because all those institutions that are somehow framing the conversation that we're having right now, they're all human creations. It might be late for other discussions, maybe around climate, on how some of the changes are irreversible, but for data, certainly not. And I think this is just the start of the conversation, truly. And what bothers me mostly, and what instigated us doing this report, is trying to shift the focus on how the conversation currently is. Why do we keep using the same kind of instruments and the same kind of framing for a conversation that can happen in a different way? This is about how we are going to organize ourselves as a civilization in the next century, and it will be a topic that will touch on so many other important challenges that we have as a global civilization. And here, what we're trying to say with the report is to provide an aspirational and positive perspective to the conversation. How can we think about the data sphere that we want? How can we and how we would govern it if we think about that notion of the commons? And we already did it as humans, laws that regulated commons, or we thought about treaties that regulated the seas, for example, as a common, or the moon. So it is possible for us to think about different regulatory and normative frameworks, but I truly think that the solution won't come solely through regulation. It will come through more awareness, more intelligence that we can build around understanding what data is really like and how it changes across sectors and across different types and uses of data, but also on how we can experiment on different instruments and be more creative and more innovative in how we address this issue. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much for that. Almost perfect timing. Well, there's 2 minutes left, and I'm a professor, so of course, with an open mic, I have to say something. The way I'd like to close it is to defend the WTO a little bit. First of all, data matters, and it's in the WTO, so we can't avoid having the conversation in the WTO. It is affecting things right now and interacting in ways. The second is it's one of the few bodies of international organizations where it's done by consensus. And so if we took it to any other international organization, the big countries would have much more influence. And in terms of the multi-stakeholder, of course, we need to have that discussion, but that's misunderstanding what the WTO is. It's not a talk shop. It's meant to regulate things and pass things and liberalize or regulate non-liberalizing things. So that's my response to Richard Hill. We have to keep the WTO in the loop, but it's certainly not the only place to have this conversation. So with that, I think I will close the session. Thank you very much on behalf of the Center for Trade and Economic Integration that I co-direct with Jos Powellen at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, and the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, who is co-sponsoring this with us. And with that, just a big thanks to all my panelists, Vint Cerf, Michael Kende, Lorrayne, Porciuncula, and Lee Tuthill. Thank you very much. And the chat, the chat response to the chat will be continued. We'll eventually get that online, so some of the questions will be answered by the panelists at a later time. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.